So good afternoon and good morning for some of you, and even good evening for some others. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on promoting a gender-responsive recovery through social dialogue. It is the second webinar in a series of 3 that we are organizing. Some of you might have participated in the first one we did, and the next and the final webinar will be held on the 22nd of June, and then we will discuss due diligence. But today we're going to talk about how social dialogue can help deliver gender equal outcomes in the world of work. And we will also talk about the impact of the pandemic and how it has affected women in particular. We will first have a presentation of the global brief on the contribution of social dialogue to gender equality. And this brief you can also find on our website. It has been translated into 4 languages, so we have it available in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. So that will be the first part of the webinar, and then in the second part we will look at how global deal partners are using social dialogue as a tool to implement policies to advance gender equality. And we have several interesting examples from Crédit Agricole, Public Services International, People First International, BNP Paribas, and Argentina. And then we will finish with a presentation from the Equal Pay International Coalition. And hopefully we will have some time left for questions at the end. But I would also encourage you to use the chat function if you want to make comments, but also if you want to ask questions, and then we can pick some of those questions at the end and ask our speakers to respond. And because of the diversity of the Global Deal Partnership, we have gathered examples which are all different, and we'll touch upon different aspects of gender equality. But I think one thing which is clear is that we need to do much more to achieve gender equality. The Global Gender Gap Report from 2020, which is issued by the World Economic Forum, paints a rather gloomy picture. That report concludes that gender parity will not be attained for almost 100 years. Although there are differences between regions, some regions are doing better than others, and particularly Europe and Latin America are those regions that they say are doing better on gender equality. And I think that this picture is also confirmed by the European Union. They have their own EU Gender Equality Index, and they conclude that EU is at least 60 years away from reaching complete gender equality if we continue at the current pace. But all this was before the pandemic. So the question is what the results will look like when the impact of the pandemic has been taken into account. And also to what extent social dialogue can help to close the gender gaps. There are many forms of social dialogue and many ways in which a gender perspective can be integrated. Of course, collective bargaining can be a strong instrument to close the pay gap, as well as policies to improve work-life balance and to make unpaid work more visible, because I think that is one of the issues. But of course, there are other ways too that social dialogue can help. And some of this is described in the Global Deal Brief. And that brings me to the first presentation today. And I'm really happy that Verena Schmidt was able to join us today. She is Labor Relations and Collective Bargaining Specialist at the ILO. And she will give us the first presentation, which will focus on the findings of this Global Deal Brief. So, Verena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and to the Global Deal for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel. So my role is to present the brief. You can see the image of the brief on the next slide, which was produced in the Conditions of Work and Equality Department. And Manuela's leadership, she's the director of this department. And I would like to start very briefly with the ILO legal framework on gender equality, namely the International Labour Standards. We have 2 core conventions on gender equality. The first 2, equal remuneration and discrimination. Now I'm sure Manuela will go into the Convention 100 on equal remuneration. What's very important up front is that we're not just talking about equal pay for equal work, but that it's equal pay for work of equal value. This is a very important distinction, which is often misunderstood. So it means you cannot just compare the wages of, let's say, two childminders in the same kindergarten. You can also compare the value of the work between a childminder and, for example, a garbage collector in the public service, which was actually done in the collective bargaining negotiations in Germany and in Australia. And it both led to increases for the childminders. And then there's three other conventions which I want to very briefly mention. Workers with family responsibility, which is really about reconciliation between family and private life. Maternity protection, which provides 14 weeks of minimum of paid maternity leave. And violence and harassment convention, which Manuela played a very leading role and which is extremely important, particularly in the pandemic, and which will come into effect in 24 days on the 25th of 20. It has now been ratified by 6 countries, including Argentina, which we'll speak later. So moving on to the next slide, the impact of COVID on gender equality has been quite dramatic from what we can see so far. And I'm presenting here global data, so it always takes a while until this is analyzed. For what we know so far, there's a widening gap in participation rates and also in gender wage gaps. In terms of participation rates, is 5% decrease, drop in women's participation globally. Talking about last year, we haven't gotten the figures yet for up until this month, but this is 2020 figures. In absolute figures, the loss of jobs for men were higher, were 80 million compared to 64 million, which can be explained that there's a 27% gap in the participation rate between men and women. Now, before the pandemic, already women were carrying out 2/3 of the care load. And during the pandemic, this will have increased further due to the temporary closure of schools and care facilities for young children, but also for elderly people. And in some countries, in America, for example, I understand they remain closed since a year and they're still closed. So this is dramatic, of course, for those who have to take up the work. There's also evidence that there's increased, yet further increased poverty. The ILO has prepared a report on inequality for this year's ILC, which is currently going on, which shows that poverty has increased further. And this can be explained that women are overrepresented at the lowest pay grades and are also overrepresented amongst those who do not have adequate social protection. Moving on to the next slide, how can we achieve better results? I'll very briefly move through these points. I have deliberately not included the examples in this presentation that we have in the brief, because obviously we'll have very competent speakers who will directly present their experience. So I don't want to duplicate anything. So firstly, improving women's participation in social dialogue. How can this be achieved? Moving on to the next slide. It's first of all very important to understand and address the structural reasons why women keep on being underrepresented in social dialogue and collective bargaining. And it's not enough to just say, oh, they don't want to. We have to understand why they don't want to. And some of the reasons, of course, are lower participation rates that I already talked about. But we also need to continue to look at continuing discrimination, increased far higher care load, and also violence and harassment at the workplace. And we also, at the same time, we need to reduce barriers for women to participate in social dialogue. So, for example, look at very simple things like meeting times, length of meetings, location of meetings, amount of meetings. And what has been very prominent also, particularly what the unions have been doing, but also the employers' organization, is offer specific training for women to be involved in social dialogue. Very briefly, moving on to the next point, reducing the gender wage gap. We have collected various examples on how this has been concretely addressed in collective bargaining and social dialogue, but we'll have the examples from the speakers. Some of the reasons why there's a continuing gender pay gap would be undervaluation of women's work, continuing evaluation, and also sex segregation across vocations and sectors, and also overrepresentation of women in unorganized sectors. Moving on to the next slide, and I'm really rushing you through. I'm just trying to give you a teaser that you actually read the brief. So the next point is reconciliation of work, family, and private life. Again, this is a very good topic and very important topic in many collective agreements and also many tripartite forums on social dialogue, particularly in terms of regulation of working hours and also banking of working hours has been extremely important, that you can save up working time while you are young and maybe single, and then you can use some of the excess time you have saved up when you have childcare responsibilities. Moving on to the next slide, it's extremely to look at vulnerable workers. First of all, of course, in the informal economy, 61% of the world's employed population are in the informal economy, and women are overrepresented in the most vulnerable groups, such as domestic workers and home-based workers. But also looking at temporary and dependent self-employed. And now I see I skipped one slide, the very important slide on violence and harassment. Sorry about that. So Convention 190, which, as I said, will come into effect in a few weeks' time. What is very important is that for the first time, there's a right to a world of work free from violence and harassment, that we have a framework for action, not just for employees, but for all workers, irrespective of their contractual status. So it includes stagiaire, interns, it includes those in training, it includes apprentices, it includes workers who have been terminated. It also can involve third parties, such as clients, which was very important. And the convention and recommendation specifically addresses the role of constituents, of workers, employers, and governments on how they can help address this problem. So that brings us to the last slide. Although the topic today is social dialogue, legislation, I know there's quite a few governments also in the room. Legislation, of course, can support collective bargaining and social dialogue by providing, for example, good gender-sensitive data on women and on the different policies have. And Manuela will be presenting a very interesting study here from France. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the other presentations. Thanks, Veronica.
Thank you very much, Verena. And I think it was really useful to have overview, even if you could not enter into detail. And now we will move to partners and Louis also, but to better understand how partners are working, promoting gender equality through social dialogue. We're going to start with Pierre from Pierre is the social relations manager. I'm very pleased to have you here today. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know that AGRICOLE has a global framework agreement with UNI, and we would be very interested to know how you together have addressed the issue of gender equality through social dialogue. So over to you.
So thank you, Veronica. Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre Cole, so I'm in charge of the labor relation at the group level at Crédit Agricole SA. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in and to present what we are doing in terms of social dialogue and gender equality. So during the next 5 to 10 minutes, I've got the daunting task of giving you an overview of who we are, how a social dialogue system works, and then focus on gender equality. So who we are, maybe we can move to the next slide. So who we are the 10th largest bank in the world, the first retail bank in the European Union, the first asset manager in Europe, the first insurer in France, and the first provider of financing to the French economy. You can see on the right part of the slide our organizational structure, and which is basically the following: 39 banks, which are called the Caisse Régionale de Crédit Agricole, representing 10.9 million mutual shareholders, hold the majority of. So Crédit Agricole SA is a public company. I'm speaking on behalf of Crédit Agricole SA. It's the holding of the Groupe Crédit Agricole SA that operates through its various subsidiaries in the field of the finance industry, ranging from asset gathering to retail banking to insurance. We are also present in the publishing business and in the real estate management. We employ around 70,000 people, 50% of them outside France, mostly in Europe, as you can see on the map. So maybe we can move to the next slide. So how labor relation system. So as I told you, we are present in 48 countries. So I won't be able to give you an insight of the various systems in force in our different subsidiaries and locations. So I will focus on the group system that is based on two pillars. The first one are the representative bodies, and the second one is the dialogue we have, an ongoing dialogue we have with the union, both at group and international level. So first, with the representative body, we've got three main representative bodies. The first one is the European Work Council that represents 40 countries. 40 countries are represented in the European Works Council, which meets annually in a plenary session and at least once a year in select committee. Just to give you an example, we are in the beginning of June and we already had 6 meetings with the select committee. So when I'm talking about ongoing dialogue, it's a real one. Second one, we've got the group committee that is composed of 13 union representatives and chaired by the president of the group. And this committee is mainly focused on the business in France. And we also have what we call the consultation committee, which is also composed of 13 union representatives and is headed by the group chief HR officer. It meets twice a year, and it's mostly dedicated to what happens in the scope of the Crédit Agricole SA and not the group as a whole. So in France, we also have lots of discussion with our union. At group level, we are negotiating with 3 representative unions, and over the last 3 years, we've signed 3 collective agreements with them. And at international level, as Véronique has said earlier, we signed a global framework agreement with the Uni Global Union on July 2019. Sorry. Maybe you can move to the next slide. Thank you. What are the links between social dialogue and gender equality? As you may know, since 2001, gender equality is a mandatory topic of negotiation in France. So all our main subsidiaries, the 12 of them in France, are covered by collective agreement dedicated on gender equality. And since 2016, we have negotiated or renegotiated over 220 collective agreements. So this, as you can see on the slide, this different kind of agreements address topics ranging from hiring to gender diversity to training to career management to professional promotion. The idea is to have an holistic approach and to change the culture as a whole, and not only fixing issues like a salary gap and things like that. We really wanted to address the whole thing. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So at group level, we adopted the same approach, and in July 2019, we signed with Global Union a global framework agreement, a large part of which is dedicated to gender equality through the following items you can see on the slide. Maybe the key features I wanted to talk about, the key feature of this agreement is that we introduce a 16-week maternity leave for all our employees, whatever the location and the business line they work for. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So gender equality is not only a theme of negotiation, it's also a theme of initiatives that are taken by the company, but discussed with our different body and social partners. So within the group, we've got lots of initiatives as such, like the one I wanted to highlight is the fact that the integration as a success, as a criterion success in the composition of the member of the Crédit Agricole group is the fact that we are reaching our goal in terms of gender equality. So maybe you can have a look at this slide. If you have any question, I will be happy to answer. Otherwise, we can go to the next one. So this is my last one with this slide that we presented to our comité de concertation a few days ago. We wanted to show you that our endeavor in the field of the gender equality are bearing fruit, because we've got lots of success to celebrate. For instance, we progress. We've made our entry in the top 15 of the ranking of feminization of government body in the SBF 120, and we were also ranked in the Time European ranking rewarding diversity leader in 2020. So we are celebrating this success with our partners, but we are deeply aware that we should carry on and mustn't drop the car. So if you have any question, that was my last slide. If you have any question, I will be happy to answer. Otherwise, I hope I keep my time.
You did perfectly. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
And I think this last slide is really interesting, and we might be able to come back to it at the end, as it would be interesting to know more how you managed to go from 90 to 40. But now I will quickly move to our next speaker, which is Veronica Montufar, who is Equality Officer and Project Coordinator with PSI, the Public Services International. And Veronica is joining us from Ecuador, so early in the morning for her. And she will speak about the impact on women workers in the sector that PSI represents, but also a bit about the solutions. So over to you, Veronica.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for the invitation. Yes, it's a pleasure for me being here. And yes, I want to expose some of the main key issues that public services women workers are facing during the pandemic. But first of all, I think that we as PSI have done a series of studies, case studies and country studies to see what is happening with our unions, what is happening with the political atmosphere during the pandemic, but as well what is happening with women's labor within the public services. So we started with a Latin American study in those countries that you see there in the slide. And in the Latin American study, we focus especially in teleworking and how teleworking was affecting the women's labor. And we finally have as a result that there was a kind of difference between the countries, but the main issues that they share was long working hours, and as well the intensification of work, and as well extra care burden. So in all those countries, governments manage differently the health emergency, but there was like a tendency of these kind of issues. And all of them have exposed that they have increased gender-based violence. Especially in Mexico and in Central America, we did a study there, and we have as a result that there was an increasement of feminicides. So there was an issue of feminicides there. The other one was focused on the UK and was held by the University of Kent and was endorsed by two of our unions, Unison and GMB. And this study was focused on the care sector and frontline care workers. And what they exposed was that there was physical and mental and economic health problems. For example, no payment of wages, lack of personal protective equipment, inappropriate advice on PPEs, unsafe working conditions. But also what they said is that there was a failure in effectively implement self-isolation and effective control of the pandemic during the first part of the emergency. But as well, we as global unions, we are working together in the care sector, and we there have a meeting where we consult the workers around the world of all the regions, what were the main issues they confront during the pandemic, and they all agree on the widespread of job loss, the lack of access on PPEs, long working hours, increase of mental health difficulties, and gender-based violence. But as well, what they said was that they also were affected of an uneven access to vaccines. So we think that even though there is a very difficult situation around the world, we have been also managing a social dialogue by trying to put forward our right of freedom of association and our right of collective bargaining. Although there is a decline in union density rates during the pandemic, and as well there we have been very conscious of the lack in the ratification and implementation of ILO Conventions 151 and 154, especially on the public sector. Those conventions allowed public services workers to have a collective bargaining on place. But even this is not a big thing. What we have seen is that social dialogue is in place, and where social dialogue is effective, we have agreed on wages, and we have agreed on working hours, and we have agreed especially on PPEs. But as well, we see as a main issue on the pandemic the issue of the care crisis, and what we see is an uneven social organization of care. So we think that this is the main structural problem that we are facing, the care crisis, and I will be talking more on that during the intervention. So what do we think there are good opportunities for us for having a proposal or a way forward on a gender transformative recovery? We really want to be very clear that we need to be gender transformative and not only gender sensitive or not only gender responsive. I think that the main issue for us is to do a transformative recovery. So we are seeing these opportunities, at first, United Nations Commission on the Status of Women on its 65th session, in the Agri conclusions, there was a specific mention of frontline health and social workers. And this recognition also declared the importance of ensuring decent work and equal pay for equal value. We think that there we have a big way of trying to put our governments in the same line and try to build on more social dialogue to try to engage in this kind of political decisions. As well, we have these generation equality forums in the context of the Beijing Plus 25 implementation, evaluation of the implementation. And we see with very good eyes this Alliance on Care that the government of Mexico, with the cooperation of UN Women, is calling on. They are calling globally all actors to join in this Alliance on Care, but specifically in Mexico, they will be working in establishing the foundations of a national care system that could guarantee the right to care. So we think that that is a very good opportunity to also address the care crisis. And what we are thinking is the main gender equality difficulty during the pandemic, but also as an structural way. I think that also in the EPIC, the Equal Pay International Coalition, we have a way forward in the public sector, but as well, we are also calling for a care manifesto to rebuild the social organization of care. So we want and we call you to join us in our care manifesto, and we will be trying to put forward this on the chat. Okay, that's everything.
Thank you so much. Now turn to our next speaker, which is Jane Rexworthy, who is the Executive Director of People First International. They have developed a series of sustainable approaches to support women into the workplace and also to upskill women. And they have some interesting projects in among other, Jordan and Mexico. So Jane will share their experiences with us. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Andre, for my slides. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much, Veronica and the team, for inviting me to speak on this really important topic. My focus is probably a little bit different in as much as we get to operate in around 40 countries around the world, and as a sector skills council and representing other sector skills councils internationally, our focus is on the deliverables of getting people with the right skills into the workplace. And as part of that, People First International, our projects all have a focus on economic, gender and social inclusion. Next slide, please. So our work enables social dialogue to design and implement solutions to build capacity and capability of the stakeholders locally. It looks to promote and create a better gender balance and look for those opportunities for women and youth and those that are requiring more support to enter the workplace. When we start our projects, our very, very first activity is to start or engage in existing social dialogue and bring the key stakeholders together to address the issues and challenges, and importantly, create the right solutions. So I want to share 3 examples of this and how we undertake this work. So next slide, please. So in Jordan, we've been working for about 6 years now on behalf of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And in the two projects that I'm going to describe to you, we had an opportunity to work really closely with a number of civil society organisations, donor funders, and the government, especially the Ministry of Labour. And within that dialogue, we identified how we could improve the opportunity for women refugees in this particular instance to access gainful employment in a number of different occupations, and also to set up their own businesses. The benefit of having the social dialogue was that it allowed for the sharing of best practice and the ability to create training interventions for women that resulted in a high percentage gaining work either directly in industry or as an entrepreneur in industries that did not conflict with family and cultural challenges. And in this instance, we achieved around an 85% success for each of the programs that were run for women. And I just wanted to share this particular slide because it showcases the model that we used. And in fact, this model has been used for youth, it's been used not just for women in this particular example. So mobilising, engaging employers right at the start was absolutely critical. So that public-private partnership involvement, really important. And having the right criteria to put people onto programme, making sure it was going to work for them. Understanding the skills needs, preparing the individuals for the workplace through core and job readiness programmes, and providing technical skills that were going to be needed. And I think the really critical factor was staying very close to the individuals to ensure that they were supported through the job placement, whether it was through the job fair or ongoing support as they accessed work. And then finally, to say that monitoring and evaluation and looking at the impact has been a really important factor of this model. And, you know, it's really nice to be able to say that after the last 5 years, this model is still sustainable, it's still running, and that many of the local partners, the local training providers, are using this model to run their programs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So my next example is a slightly different model, but again, starting with the social dialogue of working with HEI and TVET institutions and the industry boards and associations. And this is an example that we've been working on in Mexico, and a very recent example of supporting women into new opportunities. So working directly with these institutions and associations, we identified the challenges and barriers faced in recruiting women into non-traditional roles. A key predominant factor is the lack of marketing in education and industry and campaigns to encourage women into these non-traditional roles. Therefore, we're working with these partners, we work collaboratively to embed a number of easily implementable solutions, including marketing tools and best practice marketing and course information, favouring gender equality and social inclusion. And then, very important, picking up on the point that was made earlier, supporting women when they were going into roles or jobs that were not typically supportive of women, where they might receive some bias in the workplace. We provided guidance toolkits and also personal branding training, helping women and the men into understanding their own self-worth. And another really important component was providing a mentoring scheme to support individuals as they entered into work-based learning and workplace, utilising also the alumni and women that had successfully entered into these industries in the past. Next slide, please. And then finally, my third example is in the UK, looking at our hospitality and tourism industry. About 10 years ago, we created a programme called Women First. It was a membership network for the hospitality and tourism industry. And the purpose of Women First was to raise the social dialogue and the importance of women in senior roles. As part of this work, a mentoring scheme and leadership development programme called Step Up was created to support women in the industry to progress in their careers. And this was heavily supported by women in senior roles. And I think what was really interesting is we started with the hospitality and tourism industry, But quite quickly, this particular model and the program that we adopted with Step Up was taken up by a number of our financial institutions, our banks in the UK, and also in the healthcare industry and retail. So we saw a much more diverse mix of industries seeing the importance of promoting gender inclusion and progression in the workplace. So I think that's my final slide. So thank you, Andre. I know there's not going to be time for any questions now, but I'm sure in the chat I'm very happy to answer anything. And thank you very much, Veronica, and everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Jane. And yes, I would like to invite participants to make use of the chat function. I know some have already. There was, among others, a question for Pierre. You might want to reply in the chat, but you can also, if we have time left at the end, you can also come back to it. Now, I am very pleased to invite Caroline Courtin, who is Corporate Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at BNP Paribas, to make the next presentation. Also, BNP Paribas has a framework agreement with UNI, so the same trade union organization, but a different company. And we will be very interested to know more about how you have integrated gender equality into this agreement. And as far as I understand, also the promotion of diversity and inclusion, so not only limited to gender equality. So Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So almost 3 years ago now, BNP Paribas and, as you said, UNI Global Union signed a global agreement. It was the first for. And this agreement for us was extremely important because it was a comprehensive and ambitious agreement that confirms, BNP Paribas international social commitment and our ambition of being a responsible employer with regards to our employees, whether they work, regardless the place they work. This agreement had 7 topics that you can see on the screen, including gender equality in the workplace, but also promoting diversity and inclusion. If we look at the next one, here we are. So that's I've put some summarize of the key topics that were addressed in this agreement. So as you can see, for gender equality, we put no discrimination in the recruitment process. We had also equal access to training. And it's interesting because the equal access to training actually during the pandemic was really something we focused on, because we realized that some women were somehow pushed into managing the family, managing the task, the day-to-day more than they were before. And therefore some kind of drop from the training, from the time dedicated to training, because the time dedicated to the family somehow grew during that period. Of course, important also about awareness action everywhere in the world, awareness at key moment, promotion, awareness at key moment like rewards. So we were very dedicated also to this topic. On the promotion of diversity and inclusion, that's wider than just the gender equality subject, but it was important for us because the gender equality subject is embedded in the diversity and inclusion policies, that all those policies are actually spread everywhere in the world. So conscious of time, if you can, move one slide. I know I have 10 minutes, but I just wanted to give you the result of these 3 years. one of the first things that we put in place was a very important program that we signed also in 2018, where a program that finished actually after 3 years in May 2021, where we worked on gender equality in the field of activity. One of the things we can see in the business, and that we have seen also with the pandemic, is that women have a tendency to favor or to go, not favor, they go to certain type of job when men go to certain type of job. So we can work on gender equality in silos, but if we compare jobs and jobs, not in silos, but in the entire organization, then we realize that in IT, for example, we have a lot of men. In trading, we have a lot of men. And when we look at human resource marketing, we have mainly women, which create a skewed organization in terms of gender balance and gender mix. So we have worked on intensively through this program. And for the record, we were part of 40 companies, university states that work for the UN on this program. And there is a book, if you go to the .org website, with 35 public solution that were made public. So everyone release the solution they have worked on, what works, what didn't, and how those solutions can be implemented elsewhere. So the idea was to try for the world something that we can carry for gender equality, and that we can then release to the public, so no one has I would say any excuse on where to start on how to do. This book with the 35 solution is now released to the public. This type of approach push us as well to look at very specific areas and to make some commitment. So we make some commitment at the top of the organization, but now we make some commitments to embed more women in areas where we feel that we actually lack of women, and that the share is too narrow compared with what we could expect. So we have made a new commitment on this as well for the IT group. Same thing with the senior management. So we made some commitment in front of the unit to have more than 30% of women at the top of the organization, which is the case today, because we finished above 30% at the end of 2020. One thing that I mentioned also was the training action. We realized during the pandemic especially that the time dedicated to training, that we have to really monitor, was challenged during this pandemic, and that was important for us to make sure that we keep some balance on the time dedicated to the employability of our staff. One other commitment we made through this agreement was to increase at least to 14 weeks the maternity leave everywhere in the world, and to make sure that this maternity leave was also paid. So it's a full-fledged paid maternity leave, which is now in place everywhere in the world, meaning that if you are an employee of BNP Paribas and you are a woman and going into maternity leave, you have at least everywhere 14 weeks maternity leave paid during the year you give birth. And the last one was also to set up a paternity, which has been deployed to 50 countries today and cover more than 140,000 of our employees. So that's some kind of example of what is the contribution, the commitment we made, and the contribution of a deal like a global agreement for a place like BNP Paribas. And as I said previously, and I will close on this topic, for us, it was extremely important to implement an agreement of these kinds because it's, of course, a lot of work, prep work carried by HR, because we have to really understand how we can structure it. It's a lot of negotiation also with trade unions, but it also represents a culture of the group, a strong tradition of social dialogue within BNP Paribas, because at European level, we had already three European agreements, one on employment, one on gender equality, and one on stress and prevention at work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you for these very interesting examples. It gives us a better idea of what you are in this area. Personally, I think paternity leave is really important if we want to make advancement on gender equality. Now, I would like to, well, I should say also, oh, by the way, sorry, Caroline, I know that you will not be able to stay with us until the end. So I would encourage participants, if you have specific questions for Caroline, that you can write them down in the chat, and then Caroline will be able to respond before she. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Maria del Mar Ortolano, who is the Director of the Labor Code for Domestic Workers in the Ministry of Labor, Employment and Social Security in Argentina. Maria will address the impact of the pandemic on women workers in Argentina, in particular informal and domestic workers, and also how social dialogue can promote a gender responsive recovery from the pandemic. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Hi, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to join this panel today, and above all, to highlight how important the activity that brings us together is. As you may know already, the ongoing pandemic situation has completely changed our lives in more ways that we can account for, but hopefully it made us value even more those who work around us. And I think that there's where domestic workers come. I think it's really important what Verena said about care and how it has an impact in women's life, and it has a direct impact in domestic workers. I would like to start sharing with you some figures in Argentina. Here, around 1.4 million people are employed as a domestic worker. This is an activity that is almost exclusively carried out by women, as in the 99%, and it's concentrated in the age group over 35 years old. In total, they represent the 8.1% of the total employed population of the country, 8% of total population of the country, and the 17.5% of the working women. So it's really representative. 44% of domestic workers are the principal breadwinners. So they are the main economic supporter of its family. Argentina has been fighting for several decades in favor of the recognitions of the rights of the domestic workers and a tangible appreciation of their work. For some decades, they have been left behind as some other workers' rights, right? Domestic workers here have the same rights as other workers since 2013, where the law was approved, and then the Convention of Domestic Workers from ILO was ratified by the country. Bearing these figures in mind, I would like to share some words from our Minister of Labor, that he said that in able to return to new normal from this pandemic, it will require everyone's effort, but we must have a clear goal, and it is a reduction of social inequities, and we have known them until now. In order to do that, Argentina took some measures in order to protect not only work sources, but also workers' health. You know, one life that is lost is not, it's really important. And domestic workers were not excluded from them. We know that in some countries, some measurements that were taken where domestic workers were excluded. And in this country, for many years, they had been too, but in this case, they were not excluded. On the first place, there was a preventive license disposed for workers who were considered or labeled as people of risk over 60 years old and parents with school-aged children. This has a really important relevance within care economics and the thing we were talking about, women being the main people who do care in the home. Then we have the social and preventive and mandatory isolation. As this social preventive and mandatory isolation was going through, domestic workers were included in this isolation. They had the right to have their salary and mandatory paid. They couldn't be discounted the days or not paid, and even those who work for hours, here we say that they work for hours and then they are not monthly paid, well, those ones had to be paid too. And there was a prohibition of dismissals. People couldn't get dismissed out of their works, and domestic workers were included too. If they were dismissed and they accepted the dismissal, they would have to get twice paid as they were dismissed in another time. Here we have compensations for those who are dismissed from work. Well, that had to be doubled. So it was really expensive for employers to dismiss a worker. Then the government implemented means of payments and free bank account openings in order not to people to go to their works and be paid. It was mandatory to implement means of payments that were electronic. Then there was emergency family income that was provided for all domestic workers if they fulfill the requirements established for its receipt. And it was really remarked that it does not replace the salary of the domestic workers that they must receive. It was a help from the government in order for them to be able to go through this isolation. Also, there was an accompanying program that it was made from another ministry, that it is Women's Ministry, and that it was for those who are in risk context of gender-based violence, through financial support and comprehensive support for them for 6 months. This intended to contribute in the short and medium term to create a basic conditions for the construction of a project of an autonomous life free of violence. So those women who were in this violence context could apply for this program of accompanying so that they could be able to get back on their feet and be able to go back to life now and free from violence. That, as Veronica said, there were many cases where violence had escalated in family life here. It was also brought up the importance of registration. Here we have a lot of informality in domestic workers. The pandemic, the only thing that came to importance was that registered workers had more chances to go to work, especially those who made work as a care. Here we have a segment that is called the care workers from domestic, that they take care of disabled children and elder people. That those workers were able to go to work during isolation. They were authorized by the government, but they had to issue an authorization for that. And in this way, really put in importance the registration for this kind of workers. Well, then during the isolation, I think that it is really important that Argentina ratified Violence and Harassment Convention. So during 2020, there were sessions in order to recognize those elements that were key elements of violence in work. And it was this made through social dialogue. It was a table made out of employers, workers, and government sitting and trying to see whether the accent was to be put into C190 and what the problematic were with violence and harassment in work, and in what ways could the government and also employers and workers by their associations be able to enforce not these practices in work. And I've finished. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think it's really important that you have made this contribution to also put the focus on domestic workers. And as you pointed out, this is a big part of your population. So it's really a big group with very specific conditions now during the pandemic as well. So that brings me to our last speaker, Manuela Tomei, who is the Director of the Conditions of Work and Equality Department at the ILO. She's also a member of the Secretariat of the Equal Pay International Coalition, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition led jointly by the ILO, the OECD, and UN Women. And Manuela will speak about how to use social dialogue to achieve equal pay for work of equal value. So I'm very pleased, Manuela, that you are here with us today. And now I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to introduce the work of EPIC and share the experience thus far in addressing the gender pay gap, and in particular the part of the gap which is due to discrimination in wage determination. Next slide, please. In my 10-minute presentation, I will try to explain why EPIC was established, how it is structured and governed and what it does, and also how it seeks to promote the principle of equal pay for work of equal value through social dialogue. Next slide. So why EPIC? The gender pay gap, as you know, is a stubborn and universal phenomenon. According to the ILO estimates, the hourly gender pay gap globally is of 20%, but this figure conceals significant variations by country. Different factors are responsible for this gap. Many of the speakers before me have alluded to them. One is the difference in the time devoted to paid work by men and women. Men tend to work longer hours in paid employment because women share the brunt of housework and unpaid care work. Another factor is also differences in educational attainments and in the field of study. And another factor is occupational segregation, vertical and horizontal. And another cause is also the fact that there might be discrimination based on gender, which can be direct or indirect in the way in which wages are set. The principle of equal pay for work of equal value seeks to tackle indirect discrimination in wage fixing. And the principle is about ensuring that jobs that differ in content but are of equal value according to a set of objective criteria are paid equally. Now, the practical implementation of this principle has proven very challenging. There continues to be a lack of understanding regarding what the principle is all about and what it takes to give effect to it. The Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development sets through the SDG 8.5 the ambitious goal of achieving equal pay for work of equal value by the year 2030. And the preliminary evidence, as many of the speakers have already highlighted, shows that COVID has hard hit women in terms of job, working hour, and earning losses. So if we want to recover forward better, it is imperative to accelerate the reduction in gender gaps in employment and pay. Next slide, please. So how does EPIC operate? EPIC, as Veronica has already said, has a secretariat which comprises OECD, UN Women, and the ILO. It is governed by a tripartite steering group comprising the International Organization of Employers, the International Trade Union Confederations, and a number of governments. Next slide, please. And on this slide, you can see the members that are part of EPIC that come from these three groups, as well as academia, private companies, and concerned NGOs. I would like to highlight that EPIC is a community of the willing. It's not a free-riding venture. To become a member, interested parties need to meet a number of eligibility criteria. They need to make pledges and deliver on them. Next slide. So what does EPIC seeks to achieve? Well, it promotes the universal ratification and implementation of Convention 100 of the ILO. 173 member states have ratified it, but only about 45% of them have given full application to the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. Next slide. EPIC also seeks to improve the quality of national equal pay legislation and its implementation. It documents and shares relevant country experiences and good practices, reviews and disseminates tools and methodologies, including on how to measure the gender pay gap, how to conduct job evaluations free of gender bias, or how to identify the discriminatory part of the gender pay gap in an enterprise through user-friendly and low-cost software. It provides, upon request, policy support to governments, enterprises, and workers and employers organizations, and it manages the equal pay legal database that covers quite a large number of countries across the world and provides details about what the national regulatory framework established with regard to equal pay for work of equal value. Next slide, please. How does EPIC operate? It's the same one. It facilitates peer-to-peer exchanges and cooperation, organizes policy workshops and webinars on specific themes that are identified by the members. The next two themes that are on its agenda are addressing the undervaluation of women's jobs in the care sectors and how to advance equal pay for work of equal value in small enterprises. And upon request, the Secretariat also, based on a number of criteria and procedures that have been agreed upon by the steering committee, reviews tools and methodologies developed by member organizations to determine whether they qualify as good practices. Next slide. Social dialogue is key to delivering on gender equality and also on equal pay for work of equal value, as it has already been stated earlier. And I think that importance is fully reflected in the composition of the EPIC steering committee. Government consultation and collaboration with the social partners in the design and implementation of a national policy on pay equity is essential to its effectiveness, as is also the development and implementation of relevant guidance and tools. And collective bargaining at national, branch, or enterprise level can be another important means to tackle and correct the gender discrimination in remuneration. This is the case also wage fixing, which varies across jurisdiction, but minimum wages are really a very powerful mechanism to reduce the gender pay gap, especially in the lower half of the wage distribution. Let me now very briefly, in the next slide, zoom in on some preliminary findings of a study that we conducted in France on collective bargaining for gender equality. So why France? Well, France is not the only country in which we have conducted this type of study, but France presents a number of very interesting specificities. As it has already mentioned before, collective bargaining for gender equality is a mandatory field at branch level and an administered field at enterprise level. France also introduced by law in 2018 the Gender Equality Index, which seeks to monitor companies' progress towards closing the gender gap. And since 2020, it covers companies with 50 employees or more. Each year, the companies receive a score on a 100-point scale based on 5 indicators. As far with regard to the scope and the methodology of this survey, we recruited a multidisciplinary group of researchers of the University of Strasbourg to conduct these surveys in enterprises from a large number of sectors in the Euro metropolitan region of Strasbourg. The survey is based on an analysis of collective agreements and plans on gender equality at branch and enterprise level, supplemented with interviews with management and workers in the enterprises that were covered by the survey, as well as with the negotiators at branch level. And the findings and recommendations of the surveys were shared in a national tripartite consultation with the Ministry of Labor and the national social partners in December 2020. Now, findings. There are many more findings, but in the interest of time, I will just focus on a few. First, the survey revealed that there is a very high horizontal and vertical occupational segregation along gender lines in all enterprises. And there is a very strong link between occupational segregation and gender pay gap. Another very important finding is that there is a coexistence in some cases of good scores under the Gender Equality Index and significant gender pay gaps. The survey also highlighted the unevenness in the quality of the diagnostics conducted prior to the negotiation, which of course undermines also the effectiveness of the negotiation itself. Another finding relates to the very limited articulation of company negotiations with branch negotiations. And last but not least, only a few companies take sustained and corrective interventions to achieve gender equality in occupation and pay. With regard to the recommendations, one suggests to support collective bargaining negotiations in small and medium-sized enterprises through, for instance, inclusion in branch collective agreements of model collective agreements for enterprise-level negotiation. Equally important is to train negotiators on understanding of socioeconomic data, but especially being able to identify the explain part of the gender pay gap and investigating its root causes. Another very important issue that emerged was the need for better evaluate all the occupational risks that are associated with women's and men's jobs, meaning those jobs in which men and women tend to prevail and represent over 60% of the workforce. Because what indeed very often happens is that the physical and mental risks that are associated with women's jobs very often are invisible and therefore not accounted for. The establishment of a committee to monitor the implementation of collective agreements or action plans on gender equality would also be very helpful in enhancing their effectiveness. And last but not least, if we want to correct the differences in earnings due to discrimination, it's not sufficient to measure the pay gap, identify what are the underpinning causes, but we need also to remove that part of the gender pay gap which is due to discrimination. So to address that part of the gap, the study suggests prioritizing collective fixing actions, such as, for instance, providing compensation for the employee's pension contributions during parental leave, and also developing individual actions such as salary catch-up envelope. Next. So in conclusion, this is my last minute. To achieve equal pay for work of equal value, we definitely need to have adequate laws, user-friendly tools, training, political buy-in, as well as tripartite and bipartite dialogue and collaboration. And EPIC is committed to move the needle all these fronts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Manuela. That was really interesting. I think that equal pay is really one of the cornerstones for achieving gender equality. We have a few minutes left for discussion now and questions. I've seen there's been a lot of activity in the chat box, and most of the questions have actually been replied to. There were quite a few also about the ILO, the new convention against violence and harassment at work. But there was one question still from a colleague from Bangladesh, which I thought was interesting. The question is whether we should focus on women equity first or equality in this new normal era. So I was wondering if one of our speakers would like to address this issue, maybe clarify what is the difference between equality and equity. Is there a difference? Does one of our speaker wants to respond?
Well, we in the ILO actually talk about gender equality to refer to indeed discrimination, but also creating the conditions for ensuring that there is equality of treatment and opportunities between women and men. However, in order to indeed contribute to the reduction of the gender gaps in employment, not only in the quantity of employment, but also in the quality of work, there are a number, the tendency is also to try to set some targets in terms of reducing the gaps, which alludes to the need for indeed also working towards equality of outcomes. And I would say that equity would indeed capture that notion of equality of treatment, opportunities, and outcomes in order to reach gender parity or gender equality.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for that clarification. There's also a question how you calculate the pay gap, which is a very important question because that is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of discussion about that one. But before entering into that, I would like to ask another question which came up when participants registered for this webinar. And that is how we can promote more women in leadership positions. And I think we had some good company examples which show that this is possible and that they have managed to increase the number of women in important positions. But what about others? And maybe, for example, the trade unions, maybe PSI, Veronica, I interrupted you rudely before. Maybe you want to tell us about how you do to get more women in leadership position. But you are representing many women that work in the public sector, and I suppose you have more women than men in your membership. But please tell us.
Yes, PS, I have a leading position there because in our World Congress in 2002, we decided to have a parity policy. So from there to now, we have 50-50 women and men in all our leading positions around the world. So as a trade union, we have a good example there. We are trying to promote as well in our unions to have more integration of women in leadership positions. We have not been totally happy on that, but we are also working on that field. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to pick up this question? How do you make sure that we have more women in leadership positions? What are the policies to do so? What is the role of social dialogue? Yes, Pat Horn, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Pat Horn, and for 20 years I was the international coordinator of StreetNet International. It's an international federation of street vendors and informal traders whose members are majority women, but it's not an entirely women-dominated sector like domestic workers or home workers. So StreetNet International had to have a very proactive policy, and it used a quota, and a 50% quota of women's involvement in every level. And that doesn't mean 50-50. That means not less than 50% women. So it can be anything more than that, but it basically means 50% or more of women in every single activity of the organization. So both as the International Council, which is 15 people, which has to have a minimum of 8 women, every workshop that is held, all the negotiation skills training to create negotiators, at least 50% of them have to be women. So having women, so the example that, I can't remember who mentioned that, I think it was Women First, People First, sorry, talking about having, you know, women leadership in all sectors of the organization, or maybe it was Paribas. But that's very important, because otherwise what you have is that person talked about women dominating HR and men dominating global deal. And that's what I'm talking about. So in StreetNet, you won't have women dominating one part and men dominating another. You'll have women dominating many issues in StreetNet, but you won't have men dominating any part of it. So I know quotas are very controversial. There are lots of organizations who reject that as a methodology, but I can tell you that it worked extremely well for StreetNet, and the impressive women leadership that we have in StreetNet now in a mixed organization is a result of a very strict policy of 50% quota at every single level of both the structures of the organization as well as the activities of the organization, and particularly creating strong women negotiators. We talk about social dialogue. When women lead the negotiations, everybody in the organization approaches them to help them when they have problems, and it raises their profile in the organization because they become problem solvers.
Thank you very much, Pat, for sharing that experience. I do believe, as you said, that quotas can be very effective, but that they are also controversial, of course. I saw, yes, Jane.
Yes, it's just to come in on that question again. One of the things that we spent some time on our Women First campaign was looking at case studies of successful organisations that had made that change and had promoted a better gender balance within the workforce right through to senior and board level. And I think one of the fundamental things in each of the case studies is the balance around flexible hours, flexible working. And actually what's happened over the last year is COVID has provided us with a different sort of work ethic and work site into more flexible working. So actually it's a really good platform to move on from, but certainly the companies that we work with and the companies that contributed to we created a book called The Little Book of Diversity around how do you get a better balance in the workplace, and certainly flexible working, looking at a much more enticing workplace for a better gender balance and gender opportunity was key to that.
Thank you very much, Jane. I see it's actually 4 o'clock exactly in Paris when we're supposed to end this meeting. I would like to thank Irina also. You responded to the question about how to measure the pay gap. And so unless you want to add something to what you wrote in the chat. Okay, well then we just try to wrap up. I would like to thank all the speakers. A couple of them had to leave already because of other engagements, but I think it's been a really interesting conversation today. We started off with the impact of COVID. Irina spoke about the widening gender gaps, not least for the care load, which many of the speakers have pointed to. And of course, this is quite worrying, and I think we will see the outcome maybe in 1 or 2 years' time when gender equality is being measured again. This comes through in the figures. And I think one of the speakers also stressed the importance of addressing the structural issues behind gender equality. And we had a lot of good examples from the speakers on the importance of social dialogue to advance gender equality. And I hope that they provide inspiration to all of you and to us to do even more. We also had 2 presentations on global framework agreements from AGRICOLE and BNP Paribas, which showed us how you can actually integrate gender aspects through social dialogue, but there are of course other ways as well. We also touched upon the informal economy. There are more such examples in the global brief, so for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to look at our brief, I would encourage you to please do so. It's available on our website. And then we also finished with the very important work of to try to close the gender pay gap. So I think it's been a really interesting afternoon, and thank you so much to all our speakers and to all our participants, and for your active participation in the chat and for taking the floor now. It's always great to hear from you, to know what are the issues that you are focusing on. I just want to finish with one last thing, which is to remind you that our next webinar, and the last in this series, will be held in a few weeks' time on the 22nd of June. And then we will have a discussion about due diligence and how social dialogue can contribute to due diligence. And I hope to see you then. And so thank you so much from the whole of the Global Deal team, and hope to see you soon again. Bye, everybody.